Hello, good afternoon, or good morning, depending on where you're joining us from. Thank you for joining us, everybody, and welcome to the webinar on the parallels between the EU regulations on feed additives and biocidal products. I'm Joan Castelló, and I've been at Penantech for nearly 2 years now. So, first of all, I wanted to let you know that the idea or the goal of today's webinar is for feed additives or biocides producers to gain knowledge on how to perhaps access other markets. In this case, if you are a feed additive manufacturer and you are thinking about accessing the biocides market or vice versa, the idea is to give you some tips and tricks and how those two regulations relate to each other and so on. So the structure of the webinar will consist of a presentation that will last about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we will have a short Q&A session in which I will try to reply to all your questions. But if I don't worry, because we will save all your questions, and then I will get back to you via email during the following weeks. Please bear in mind that the slides of this webinar, the presentation, will be sent to you by email as well during next week, and that this webinar is being recorded and will be uploaded to Penantech's YouTube channel also within the next week or so. And with that, I think we can move on and see the outline of the webinar. So we'll start with an introduction, and we will get a quick overview on the EU regulatory framework on biocides. I'm afraid today we won't have time to go through the feed additives regulations, but if you are not familiar with them, you are more than welcome to access Penantech's YouTube channel, and there you will find some other webinars and short videos explaining specific parts of this regulation. So feel free to visit our YouTube channel, and you will find some information on feed additives. As I said, today we're going to focus on the framework for biocides. We will see the registration procedure for both active substances and biocidal products and the data requirements for the registration of those. And we will finish with the parallels between the mentioned regulations. And we will focus on what data, what studies can be used in both registrations. And finally, the last section will cover the substances that are currently authorized for uses as both feed additives and biocides. So yes, let's get started with the introduction and the regulatory framework. Well, this is some etymology here. The word biocide comes from two words. The first part comes from ancient Greek bios, which means life, and the second part comes from Latin sida, which means killer. So basically, biocide is a life killer, but luckily for us, our legislative texts have a more complex definition that helps us understand what they are and how they work. So according to the current regulation, a biocidal product is a substance or a mixture consisting of containing or generating one or more active substances with the intention of destroying, deterring, rendering harmless, preventing the action, or exerting a controlling effect on any harmful organism by means other than just physical or mechanical action. So yeah, that last bit is, I think, quite important, because imagine that you have a harmful organism that could be a cockroach, and well, you can kill a cockroach with your shoe, but your shoe is not a biocide, because of course your shoe is just killing the cockroach with just physical or mechanical forces. So yes, biocides are basically those substances that act by means other than those physical or mechanical actions. Right, so what's the regulatory framework in the EU for biocides? Prior to 1998, biocides were not regulated in most countries in the EU. I think only maybe the Netherlands and a couple other countries regulated them before the 1998. But then in 1998, the Biocidal Products Directive, or BPD, entered into force. This directive was developed in the 1990s and was based on the Directive for Plant Protection Products that was released in 1991. So yeah, the Biocidal Products Directive entered into force in May 2000, and its intention was to harmonize the European market and to protect, of course, humans, animals, and the environment. But only 12 years after it came into force, we got the new Biocidal Products Regulation. It came into force only 8 years ago, and it started applying in September 2013. Once again, this Biocides regulation is in analogy with the Plant Protection Products Regulation that came into force only 3 years before the Biocidal Products Regulation appeared. So, of course, this new regulation replaced the old directive. And I'm going to make a stop here. And for those of you who are not familiar with European legislation, the main difference between a directive and a regulation is that whereas a directive only proposes certain goals or achievable terms, and then it is up to the individual member states to devise their own legislation and their own laws that define how to reach those goals, a regulation is a legally binding act, and it must be applied in the entirely European Union. So whereas a directive is more flexible for each country, a Biocidal Products Regulation establishes the law that must be complied in the whole European Union. Right. So in terms of regulatory agencies, it is the European Chemicals Agency, or ECHA, the one that's in charge of biocides. ECHA is the driving force in implementing the EU's chemical legislation, which is not only the biocides legislation, but also other regulations such as the REACH regulation, that stands for Registration, Evaluation, and Authorization and Restriction of Chemicals, and the CLP regulation, that stands for Classification, Labeling, and Packaging of Chemicals. So those are the three main regulations that ECHA is in charge of implementing. But with regard to biocides, there's this Biocidal Products Committee, or BPC, within ECHA, that prepares opinions of ECHA related of ECHA processes related to the BPR, right? The BPR, remember, is the Biocidal Products Regulation. And what the Biocidal Products Committee does is prepare opinion for the active substance approval and the union authorization of biocidal products. Don't worry if you're not familiar with these terms, because we will cover them later on, so everything's fine. And then within the BPC, there are 4 different working groups. The first one works on the efficacy of the substances and the products. There's another one on environmental issues, another one on human health, and the last one that works on analytical methods and physicochemical properties. Last thing I wanted to highlight is that each European member state, and actually also the countries within the European Economical Area, appoint 1 member to the BPC that is in the office for a renewable term of 3 years. And so with that, we've got a very brief overview of the regulatory framework. And now we will start diving into the registration procedure, first for active substances and then for biocidal products. So, yeah, as I said, biocidal products contain or are based on 1 or more active substances, and active substances are defined of course, substances or microorganisms that have an action on or against harmful microorganisms or organisms. The approval of active substances takes place at the union level, meaning that once an active substance is approved, products containing this active substance can be formulated throughout all Europe, right? Active substances that meet the exclusion criteria cannot be approved according to the regulation unless it is a substance that's needed for a public health emergency and there are no alternatives available. The exclusion criteria are defined in the regulation. I can quickly comment some of the criteria. For example, if a substance is carcinogenic, mutagenic, it's an endocrine disruptor, it's bioaccumulative, or things like that, those are exclusion criteria, and then the substance is usually not approved unless, as we said, there's a public health issue and there are no alternatives. Finally, something to highlight is that active substances need to be approved before the authorization for a product containing them can be granted. That means that if a producer wants to register a product and the product is based on a new active substance that's not yet registered, the producer cannot register the product straight away. They have to register first the active substance, and only after the active substance is approved, they can formulate and register the product. I think that's very important to keep in mind, right? So in the next slide, we have an overview, a schematic overview of the registration procedure for active substances. On the left-hand side of the screen, you can see the key players. Of course, one of them is the applicant. Then we've got the ECHA, the European Chemicals Agency, was in charge of coordinating the approval process and providing the necessary tools both to the applicant and to the evaluating authorities. Then within ECHA, we have the Biocidal Products Committee that, as we commented before, its members are appointed by member states and European Economical Area countries. Then we've got the Evaluating Competent Authority. That's the authority from an EU member state. For example, if it was in Spain, it would be a Ministerio de Sanidad, but in other countries, there are other specialized ministries for that. This authority is chosen by the applicant. There has to be an agreement between the member state authority and the applicant to go ahead with the registration. And finally, we've got the European Commission, who has the final decision on the approval or the denial of the active substance, right? So if you take a look at the diagram, you can see that the first step, well, the step 0 that's not here would be the preparation of the dossier and the whole data package. And then this dossier is submitted to ECHA, who performs a format check. And if everything's all right, the applicant has to pay a fee to ECHA. These fees are detailed in a separate regulation that we can see maybe later on, or I can send it to those interested by email. But yes, there are different fees according to what type of registration you're going to do, right? So once the applicant pays the fees to ECHA, and the dossier is forwarded to the evaluating competent authority from the member state, and they perform a completeness check. If everything's all right, the applicant has once again to pay fees, this time to the member state competent authority. This fee can vary a lot among different EU member states. So that's something to take into account when looking for a member state to register your active substance. But yeah, moving on, after the fee to the member state is paid, the applicant has some time to provide any additional information that could be requested during the completeness check. And once this information is requested and the fee is paid, the evaluating competent authority starts the dossier evaluation, and they draft an assessment of the evaluation. And once they are finished, the assessment is submitted to the applicant, and the applicant has a chance to provide written comments to the draft assessment and provide their feedback. And once the applicant has provided their comments, and the assessment is forwarded to ECHA. In this case, the Biocidal Products Committee takes a look at the assessment and release the assessment for public consultation and to see if there are any candidates for substitution. And finally, the DPC issues their opinion, which is then used by the European Commission to decide on the approval of the active substance. So that's common, as I said, to all active substances, because the registration of active substances take place at an EU level. But once the active substance is approved, we move to the approval or the registration of the product, right? And this can be done through 3 different registration pathways. The choice of the pathway is based on the type of product that you are registering and also on the number of countries that you are intending to commercialize it. So, for example, if you are intending to commercialize the product in 1, 2, 4, or 5 countries, maybe a national authorization followed by a mutual recognition process is the best option. Why? Because it's cheaper. And basically, with this process, what the applicant does is they submit the dossier for the product to a member state, and the authority of the member state evaluates the application and makes a decision, in theory, within 1 year. But that's in theory. After the member state has issued a decision, if it's an approval, of course, then the applicant can request the mutual recognition to other member states. But with the new Biocides regulation that entered into force 8 years ago, applicants have the option to request a union authorization, which is actually it's quite expensive compared to a national authorization, but it allows the product to be commercialized throughout all the European Union. In this case, the procedure is quite similar to what we've seen for active substances. The applicant chooses a member state to act as a rapporteur member state, and this member state performs the assessment and forwards the assessment to ECHA, who issues an opinion for the Commission to make a decision. And finally, the third pathway is the simplified authorization, and this is the one that we are going to focus more on during this webinar. This procedure is only for products that meet certain criteria that are specified in the regulation and that we are going to see in the next slide. So the simplified authorization procedure for biocidal products is thought or is intended for products that are less harmful for the environment and for humans and animals, right? And the criteria that products must comply with are the following 4 points that we see here. The active substance or substances that are contained in the product must be listed in Annex 1 of the BPR that we will see in the next slide. And moreover, the product cannot contain any substance of concern. Of course, the product has to be sufficiently effective, and the handling and use of the product cannot require personal protective equipment. That can be a setback, the last point, for applicants that are trying to get a microorganism-based product through a simplified authorization, because ECHA considers that due to their proteinaceous nature, all microorganisms are potential sensitizers, and therefore it is required to use personal protective equipment when handling these kind of products. But this could change in the future. There are ongoing conversations. We don't know how this is going to end. That's how the law is at the moment. But as I said, it's only for microorganism-based products. The other cases should be assessed on a case-by-case basis, of course. The procedure for the application in this case is quite similar to the procedure for a national authorization. The dossier is submitted to just one member state that performs the evaluation and decide if the product can be authorized or not. And after that, instead of requesting a mutual recognition, the applicant or the manufacturer can commercialize the product straight away in the rest of European member states without requesting mutual recognition. They just have to notify the relevant countries before 30 days before they place the product on the market. So that's quite a good deal for manufacturers. So as I said, let's take a look at Annex 1 of the BPR, which lists the active substances that can be used to formulate products eligible for the simplified authorization. This is the Annex 1, the list of substances that we're talking about. As you can see, it has 7 different categories. The first one being food additives. Unfortunately, we don't have feed additives here, just food additives in category 1. Well, yeah, there are currently 6 food additives that can be used as biocides. Then category 2 are substances included in Annex 4 of Regulation 1907 from 2006. That's the REACH regulation that we discussed before. Then category 3, which is actually empty, is reserved for weak acids. Category 4 is for traditionally used substances of natural origin. Category 5 are pheromones. Category 6 are substances for which a member state has validated an active substance dossier. So these are substances for which an applicant has submitted a dossier to a member state. And finally, category 7 are other active substances. And in this case, it's like limbo, where the active substances that have no category go to, right? So now that we know the registration procedure or the different registration options that we have for biocidal active substances in our products, let's take a look at the data requirements, and we will start by the data requirements to include a new active substance in Annex 1. So if you're a manufacturer and you want to include your active substance in Annex 1 because you think it is safe and it can be used for the manufacturing of biocidal products, there's a regulation, that's Regulation 88 from 2014, that specifies the data requirements that you need for inclusion in categories 1 to 6. Category 7, that's the others. In this case, the European Commission has not specified the data requirements for inclusion in that category. So as of today, applicants can only include their substances in categories 1 to 6. For category 6, it's actually the most complex, and the applicant needs to submit a dossier containing a full data package to a member state. That means that the applicant has to prepare a dossier as if it was a regular active substance, not an Annex 1 active substance, and submit it to a member state. What's the advantage compared to a regular active substance? Of course, once this active substance is listed in category 6, you can formulate products that can go through a simplified authorization procedure. Otherwise, if you register an active substance through the regular pathway, you also have to register your biocidal products through the union authorization or the national authorization. So there's this advantage that if you register through category 6, although you have to generate all the data for the active substance, then the product is eligible for the simplified authorization. Conversely, for categories 1 to 5, the procedure is much simple, and the applicant only needs to provide, first of all, evidence that the substance complies with the category in which they are seeking the inclusion. So, for example, if an applicant is seeking inclusion in category 1, that are food additives, the applicant would have to demonstrate that that substance is actually a food additive, and that's quite an easy thing to do because there are databases and there are registers where you can see that the substance is listed as a food additive, and that's it, right? So the second thing that the applicant needs to provide is the identity of the substance with simple testing, and then the intended uses of the products for which an authorization will be sought. That's fairly easy as well. You just have to describe how will you use the products and provide characterization studies for the substance. And finally, and perhaps this is the most tricky point, the applicant needs to provide evidence to demonstrate that there is consensus within the scientific community that the substance does not give rise to concern, meaning that the substance is safe, basically. That, for those of you who are familiar with US regulations, is quite similar to the generally recognized as safe procedure, the GRAS procedure in the United States, in which you also need to provide evidence that there is a consensus within experts in the subject that the use of the substance is safe, right? The difference is that in the US GRAS, you can only use published data, and in this case, you can use published data, but if not, the applicant can also generate their own data to demonstrate that the substance gives no rise to concern. So that's for Annex 1. And then let's see now how to register what are the data requirements for regular active substances. In this case, the information requirements, and there are a lot of them, they are listed in Annex 2 of the Biocidal Products Regulation. They are divided into a core data set and an additional data set. Basically, the difference is that the core data set should be provided entirely unless there is scientific evidence that it's impossible to perform a certain test, or there is evidence that a substance does not need to be tested for some specific parameter. And the additional data set is determined by the properties and the intended use of that substance. And something very important to keep in mind is that when an applicant is submitting an application, a dossier for an active substance, they should also submit a dossier for at least one representative biocidal product that contains this active substance. That means that if you are planning to register a new active substance, besides the active substance dossier, you need to prepare a dossier for a product that contains this active substance and submit it at the same time, although this product will not be authorized, at least by at that moment. This is only done to see how the active substance behaves in a potential product, right? So mixed with other excipients or other ingredients. And well, in some cases, the representative product can be a very simple product containing only the active substance and a solvent. But in other cases, if the applicant if the applicant prefers it, they can submit a representative biocidal product dossier that's more complex and contains, well, maybe it's closer to the final formulation that they wish to commercialize. But yes, please keep in mind that this is only for the active substance registration, and that this dossier for a biocidal product will not be evaluated yet. So the data requirements for the approval of biocidal products, regardless if you go through the union authorization or through a national authorization, and the information requirements are the same, and they are listed in Annex 3 of the BPR. Once again, they are divided into a core data set and an additional data set. The difference is the same. Core data set is mandatory for all products, and the additional data set is determined by the properties, the intended use, the exposure, etc. And something that I didn't mention before is that both the active substance and the biocidal product dossier are compiled. It's not like in the case of feed additives, where you compile your dossier using Microsoft Word, or you submit it in a PDF form, right? In the case of Biocides, the dossier is compiled using Euclid, which is a software that you can download for free. The link's on ECHA website, and you can download it, and it compiles the dossier. Well, you enter the information and it compiles the dossier for you. And once the dossier is compiled, the dossier is submitted to ECHA and to the relevant member state authority through R4BP, which stands for Register for Biocidal Products. It's a tool from the European authorities used for the communication with applicants, authorities, and the submission of information, etc. Right, so now that we have located where's the information requirements, let's take a look at what we actually need to submit in a biocide dossier. And as you can see, we haven't divided this part into active substances and biocidal products because the dossier content is pretty much the same. Of course, the complexity of a product is much higher than that of an active substance, because the product, as we said, contains also solvents, excipients, perfumes, or whatever. But the head of the sections is pretty much the same. So you can see the first one is the information of the applicant. Of course, the applicant has to identify itself. Then we've got these three sections that are based on the characterization and identity. The first one is information on the identity of the substance. second one is physical, chemical, and technical properties, and the other one is the methods for identification and analysis. And for those of you who are familiar with feed additive applications, you will see that this would be the equivalent to section 2 of a feed additive dossier, right? And then we have the efficacy section for biocides. This, in the case of feed additives, would be section 4. And then on the right-hand side of the screen, we have these 4 sections that are toxicological profile, ecotoxicological studies, and measures to protect people, animals, and the environment, and finally the classification and labeling, that perhaps in the case of feed additives, this would be the equivalent to section 3. And well, luckily for us, ECHA has released a set of guidance documents to help us understand and fulfill the information requirements. As you can see, they have 5 volumes of guidance documents. The first one being related to identity, physical, chemical properties, and analytical methods. The second one to efficacy, third one to human health, and then there's one on environmental issues. Then volume 5 is guidance for specific cases, such as, for example, you can see disinfection by products, endocrine disruptors, microorganism-based products, etc. We're not going to get into that today. We're just going to focus on volumes 1 through 4. And these volumes, as you can see, are divided into 3 different parts. Part A describes basically how to fulfill the information requirements that are set in the regulation, and therefore it's directed to applicants. It shows applicants how to fulfill the requirements, and it explains the test methods that can be used and how to interpret the legislation. Whereas parts B and C are focused on explaining the guiding principles for the evaluation of the applications that need to be performed by the authorities. So that means that parts B and C are for the evaluating authorities to understand how they have to analyze your data and how to prepare their assessment. Right, so I think that's all regarding the data requirements. As you have seen, we have gone very quickly through the first 3 parts. As I said, it's just a quick overview of the legislation and the data requirements for biocides. And now we are getting to the interesting part, or the most interesting part of the webinar. As I said at the beginning of the webinar, for those of you who joined later, our idea with this webinar is to provide manufacturers of feed additives the tools or the tips and tricks to access the biocide market, and vice versa. So in this section, we will explain what are the data requirements for feed additives that can be applied to biocide registrations, and also the other way around. So in terms of identity and physical chemical properties and analytical methods, well, there are not many good news, because the only information that can be reused for both applications is the basic identity information, such as the nomenclature, identification numbers, like the CAS number, the EC number, or if it's an enzyme, the enzyme number, chemical formula, things like that, that actually are descriptive, don't require any testing. And also, you can reuse the manufacturing method description and the flowchart. But instead, the other analysis, like the batch-to-batch variation, purity, and so on, in the case of the Biocidal Products Regulation, the reports must be GLP compliant, which is not the case for the feed additive reports. So if you are a feed additive manufacturer and you have prepared your batch variation reports and your purity reports, you'll probably have to redo all those under GLP conditions if you want to present an application for a biocidal active substance. The other way around, well, you are playing with some advantage here, because if you're a biocide manufacturer, you probably have those reports GLP compliant, and of course, there's no problem in using those for the registration of a feed additive. But once again, with the physicochemical properties, we find the same problem, right? In the case of the guidance for feed additive registrations, there are no method requirements, except I think for the dusting potential, EFSA recommends some ISO methods, but that's it. Whereas ECA, in case of the Biocide Products Regulation, defines the test methods that need to be used to test each property related to physicochemical properties. Those are basically ISO, but OECD and CEN methods as well. And even we have some methods from the test methods regulation. So this is the same case as before. If you are a feed additive manufacturer, you probably haven't followed these methods, or perhaps yes, but generally not. So you cannot use them for a biocide registration. But if it's the other way around, all these tests, you will be able to use them for the registration with EFSA of a feed additive. Conversely, in terms of safety, the studies are pretty much the same in both cases, right? As you can see, all the OECD guidelines that are recommended for the registration of feed additives are also recommended for the registration of biocides. Well, in terms of skin, eyes, respiratory toxicity, you can see all of them are the same. I've highlighted some of them with an asterisk because they are in vivo tests. And in this case, ECA is much more strict than EFSA in terms of testing, especially with vertebrates. If an applicant wants to run a test using vertebrates with ECA, they have to notify the authority, and the authority needs to grant permission to run those tests, because for ECA, testing in vertebrates is only a last resort. But as you can see, there are also plenty of in vitro tests. So in principle, that's nothing to worry about. All right. And then in terms of subchronic, chronic, reproductive, and prenatal toxicity, it's basically the same. The studies that are recommended for the registration of a feed additive can also be used for the registration of biocides, and vice versa. And finally, in terms of environmental safety, we are in the same scenario as in the case of toxicity and human safety. As you can see, all the OECD methods that are recommended or suggested in the EFSA guidance also appear in ECA guidance for biocides. So, well, we see that in terms of identity, we cannot reuse the studies, but in terms of safety, basically everything we do, we can reuse for the registration in the other regulatory area. So I think in the end, those are good news, because perhaps the identity studies are cheaper or less difficult to perform than these environmental health and human safety studies, right? And obviously, in terms of efficacy, the data cannot be reused, because, well, the efficacy that you are measuring for a biocide is completely different than the efficacy that you want to see in a feed additive. In the end, what you want to see with a biocide is how it destroys microorganisms in certain surfaces or environments, and with feed additives, you want to see benefits on the animal nutrition. So, yeah, unfortunately, if you want to register your feed additive as a biocide, you will have to run new tests. And if you want to register your biocide as a feed additive, it's the same. You have to run new efficacy tests. So yes, as you can see, well, you have this list in the last 3 slides of the studies that can be reused in both registrations. And with that, I think we can move on to the last section of today's webinar, that are the substances that are currently authorized for use as both biocides and feed additives, right? So here in this first slide, we see that we have only 5 substances. The first 4 belong to the technological category. They are specifically preservatives. You can see that, for example, sorbic acid is a preservative in the feed additives regulation, and is also a preservative in the biocidal active substances database. The curiosity about the active substance database is that it specifies for what type of products, of biocidal products, you can use this active substance. And in the case of sorbic acid, you can only use it for product type 6, which belongs to preservative for products during storage. That excludes, for example, wood or food, etc. Right? Then the next example, which is potassium sorbate, is also a preservative, but it can be used for product type 6 and product type 8. So in this case, as you can see in the bottom of the table, product type 8 are wood preservatives. So in this case, potassium sorbate can be also used in wood preservatives. Then we get to formic acid. In this case, formic acid is also thought for product type 6, but also for disinfectants. Disinfectants, we have product type 2, 3, 4, and 5. So, for example, product type 2 are disinfectants that are not intended for direct application on humans. And this would be, for example, household disinfectants and the ones that you use to disinfect your floors or the kitchen or whatever. Then product type 3 are veterinary hygiene disinfectants, and product type 4 are food and feed area disinfectants. So, for example, the ones that they would use in slaughterhouses or places in which food or feed is being manipulated. And then citric acid is only authorized for product type 2 that we already commented. And ethanol, which is not a technological but a sensory feed additive, in this case it's a flavoring, and can be used both for disinfectants and preservative biocides. So yes, you have once again here the product types in which it can be used. And well, it's pretty much the same as in formic acid, except you can use it in less disinfectant products. But well, this is the short example because, as I said, we are not focusing on regular biocides in today's webinar, rather than on the simplified authorization procedure. And that's why in this slide, we have, once again, Annex 1. If you remember, Annex 1 lists the active substances that can be used in products that will be eligible for the simplified authorization. And in here, we have plenty of food additives. So, for example, only in category 1, we have lactic acid, sodium benzoate, acetic acid, and propionic acid that are technological feed additives. Once again, they are preservatives. So perhaps if you are a feed additive producer that's using one of these substances, and you can keep in mind that this substance is listed in Annex 1, and that you can formulate a biocide and get it authorized through a simplified authorization. So that's a pretty easy way to access the biocides market. Then category 2, we have ascorbic acid, which is also a feed additive, an antioxidant in this case. In category 4 and 7, we have the lavender oil, peppermint oil, and citronellol, that they are all feed additives, sensory feed additives, they are flavorings. So once again, producers that are commercializing feed additives based on these substances and want to enter the biocides market, this is a really good chance to get your biocidal product registered through a simplified authorization. But there's more, and bentonite in category 7 of Annex 1 is a technological feed additive. In this case, it's a pellet binder. And we also have iron sulfate that, once again, is a sensory feed additive. This is a flavoring. So as you can see, most of the substances that are listed in Annex 1 are already authorized as feed additives, and it's a very good chance for producers to try and formulate a biocidal product that can be registered through a simplified authorization. So I think that with this, yes, we just got to the end of the presentation, and now I can try and answer some of your questions. Well, we actually received some questions beforehand. Some of you submitted your pre-questions via email, and I have compiled actually some of them here. So I'm going to try to answer those first, and then if we've got more time, we can try and answer some others. So the first question that we received is whether it is possible to submit an EFSA opinion to support the registration of a biocidal active substance. Well, in this case, the answer is yes. You can use it, you can submit it to support the registration, but you wouldn't be able to base the whole registration on an EFSA opinion, basically because regulatory bodies, the evaluating authorities, usually want to see the individual studies. They want to see the study design, the raw data, the data treatment, the statistics, etc., etc. And all of that is not reflected in an EFSA opinion. So they would require the full studies. Moreover, as we've seen before, the identity and characterization requirements are different between the feed additive and the Biocides regulation. So if you haven't generated batch-to-batch and purity information on GLP conditions, those would most likely not be acceptable for a biocide registration. And finally, and the most obvious one, is that the data on the efficacy as a biocide is still required. So you cannot go ahead and submit an application for a biocidal active substance just with an EFSA opinion for a determined substance. As I said, you can use it to support the registration, but that's all. You can send it as an annex, maybe. Then we've got another question, very interesting one. Someone asked if, besides feed additives, there are any feed materials that are already authorized as biocidal active substances. The answer is yes. There are these 4 feed materials actually that are already authorized, and they are authorized in Annex 1, which is even more interesting. And as you can see, well, those are quite simple feed materials. We have egg powder, honey, fructose, and cheese. The thing is that these substances, in the case of biocides, are only registered to formulate products belonging to product type 19. Product type 19 are repellents and attractants, if I'm not wrong. So in this case, the feed materials would be used to attract the organism, the animal, I guess, to a certain trap. But yes, if you are a manufacturer of one of those, you can access the biocides market through simplified authorization. So one more question, I think we got, yes. Someone was asking whether a biocide that's registered in the European Union can also be sold in Switzerland. The answer is yes. And Switzerland and the European Union have a mutual recognition agreement in place that includes biocides. So if a biocidal product is authorized in the EU, it can also be placed on the Swiss market under this MRA, Mutual Recognition Agreement. And moreover, Switzerland also adopts the assessment procedures for active substances from the EU. So an active substance that's registered in the EU can be used for a Swiss manufacturer to formulate a product and register it in Switzerland. And well, we didn't have any more questions. I see that we received during the webinar loads of them. And I will try to get back to all of you by email, because actually now we're running out of time. So during the following week, you can expect me to get back to you. I will try my best to give you an answer to your questions. And well, thank you all for joining us today. And as I said at the beginning, these slides will be shared with you via email next week. and the webinar will also be uploaded to a Pen and Text YouTube channel during the following weeks. Meanwhile, please feel free to navigate our YouTube channel to watch other webinars that we have recently posted regarding feed additives, novel foods, infant nutrition, and well, we have all sorts of contents. And then if you need more information on our services, you have here the link to our website, or you can send me an email directly and I'll be happy to help you. So thank you all very much for joining, and I hope to speak to you all soon. Bye-bye.